You stare into the polished silver, but the face staring back is not your own. It is a mask of perfect, horrifying white. The thick layer of cerussa, a paste of white lead and vinegar, feels cool and heavy on your skin, a beautiful shroud hiding the sores beneath. Your lips, stained a brilliant, fashionable red with cinnabar, burn with the faint, sweet poison of mercury. This is the price of beauty. This is the toxic reality of a Roman woman. The first time Livia saw true beauty, it was painted onto the face of her mother. She was a child of only 6 years, hiding behind a heavy damask curtain, peering into the small private chamber where her mother, Vipsania, performed the sacred morning rites. It was not a ritual of devotion to the gods, but to a far more demanding and unforgiving deity, Roman society. Livia watched, mesmerized, as the slave girls, their faces impassive and their hands steady, moved with the quiet efficiency of temple priestesses. They brought forth an array of pots, vials, and stone palettes that glittered like a sorcerer's collection. There was the pot of cerussa, the foundation of all aristocratic beauty, a substance known to be so dangerously caustic that its production was left to the most disposable of slaves, men whose hands and lungs would be eaten away by the very material they prepared for the faces of Rome's elite. Livia watched as her mother's attendant, a quiet Greek woman named Lyra, dipped a fine brush into the thick, white paste. With practiced strokes, she began to erase Vipsania's true face, covering the fine lines of worry around her eyes, the faint flush of life in her cheeks, the very map of her humanity. The face that emerged was a perfect, blank canvas of alabaster, an unnerving, inhuman perfection that was the height of fashion. Livia did not understand the chemistry, the slow, creeping death that was being applied with such care, but she understood the transformation. Her mother, a woman of flesh and blood, was becoming a statue, a work of art, a symbol. And in that moment, a seed of understanding, as toxic as the lead itself, was planted in Livia's young mind. To be loved, to be admired, to be a woman of worth, one must first be erased. The air in the room was thick with the cloying scent of rosewater and the sharp, metallic tang of the cosmetics, a smell that would forever be linked in Livia's memory with the performance of femininity. She saw the kohl, ground from antimony or soot, used to create the dramatic, almond-shaped eyes that were so desired. She watched Lyra apply it with a thin rod of ivory, a delicate and dangerous procedure that could easily introduce infection into the eye itself. Then came the rouge, a vibrant splash of red ochre, or, for the truly wealthy, the infamous cinnabar, a mercury ore that promised a vibrant, lasting blush but delivered a slow, agonizing decay of the nervous system. Livia saw her mother flinch, just for a second, as the pigment was applied to her cheeks and lips. Was it a sting of pain or a tremor of vanity? Even then, Livia sensed the two were intertwined, a dark and necessary partnership. This daily ritual was not merely about aesthetics, it was a declaration of status, a uniform of power. A pale face signified a life lived indoors, away from the sun-scorching labor of the lower classes. It was a testament to a life of leisure, a life so privileged that one did not even need to expose their face to the elements. It was a lie, of course, a carefully constructed artifice, but it was a lie that the entire structure of their society was built upon. Livia stepped back from the curtain, the heavy fabric muffling the soft sounds of the chamber. She touched her own cheek, her skin still soft and unadorned, and felt a strange, new yearning. It was not for the beauty itself, but for the power it seemed to grant, the silent, unassailable authority of the painted face. She was too young to see the prison within the perfection, the slow sacrifice hidden behind the mask. She only saw the adoration in her father's eyes when her mother finally emerged, a flawless porcelain doll, ready to face the world. As Livia blossomed into her teenage years, the abstract lessons of her mother's vanity table became her own lived reality. The transition from observation to participation was a rite of passage as significant as any religious ceremony. At the age of 14, on the eve of her betrothal to a senator 3 times her age, her mother decreed it was time. The world of childhood, with its sun-kissed skin and natural expressions, was to be shed like a snake's skin. Livia was led not to a playroom, but to the very same chamber where she had spied on her mother. This time, The pots and vials were for her. Lyra, the Greek slave, was still there, her own face now etched with the fine lines of time, a stark contrast to the ageless masks she created. Lyra's hands were no longer as steady, and a faint tremor sometimes betrayed a deeper affliction, a consequence, perhaps, of years spent handling the very poisons she was about to apply to Livia's youthful face. The initiation began with the skin. To achieve the coveted pallor, it was not enough to simply apply the cerussa. The skin itself had to be prepared, punished into submission. Livia endured nightly masks of crocodile dung and ass's milk, concoctions believed to soften and whiten the complexion. The stench was nauseating, a grotesque perfume of decay and luxury that clung to her hair and her bed linens. She was instructed to bathe in water infused with lead, a practice that promised a luminous sheen but delivered a creeping paralysis to the nerves. Her body hair was ruthlessly removed with a brutal mixture called celothrum, a depilatory agent often containing arsenic, which left her skin red, raw, and weeping. A torment, she was told, was a small price for smoothness. Then came the cerussa. The first time the cold, heavy paste touched her face, Livia felt a profound sense of dissociation. It was as if her own identity was being suffocated under the weight of the lead. The paste was thick and unforgiving, filling every pore, and its application was an art form in itself. Too little, and the natural pink of her youth would show through, a sign of vulgar vitality. Too much, and it would crack when she smiled, a social catastrophe. Livia had to learn to control her own face, to keep her expressions muted and serene, to become the living statue her mother had been. The irony was a blade twisting in her gut. To be seen as the ideal woman, she had to erase every trace of the living girl she was. The headaches started soon after. At first, they were a dull throb behind the eyes, easily dismissed as the strain of a young bride's anxieties. But they grew in intensity, a hammering anvil inside her skull that sometimes left her dizzy and nauseous. Her gums began to ache, and a strange metallic taste lingered in her mouth, a phantom flavor that no amount of wine or honeyed figs could wash away. She complained to her mother, who dismissed her concerns with a wave of a perfectly manicured hand. All women of quality suffer for their beauty, child. Vipsania had said, her own lead-painted lips barely moving. It is a sign of your discipline, your commitment to our family's honor. Livia learned to be silent. She learned that her body was not her own. It was a canvas for the ambitions of her family, and its slow degradation was a necessary, unspoken part of the bargain. The world she was being prepared for was one of surfaces, of silent judgments made in the flicker of a torchlit banquet. Her wit, her thoughts, her heart, these were secondary. Her primary value was written on her skin, in a language of toxic, luminous white. The wedding was a masterpiece of political theater, and Livia was its central, silent prop. Her husband, the Senator Gellius, was a man whose face was a roadmap of political battles and indulgent appetites. His skin was leathery and sun-spotted, a testament to a life lived in the public forum and at the banquet table. When he looked at Livia, his eyes, clouded with the cataracts of age, did not see a young woman trembling on the precipice of life. He saw a symbol of his own virility and status, a beautiful, pale ornament to adorn his household. Livia's wedding look was the most elaborate she had ever worn. The cerussa was applied in thicker layers than ever before, a flawless mask of aristocratic purity. Her eyes were heavily lined with kohl, giving her a look of wide, doll-like innocence that belied the terror coiling in her stomach. Her lips were stained a deep, bloody red with the most expensive cinnabar, a shade that spoke of wealth and a dangerous, fashionable allure. A fine powder of crushed pearls was dusted over her face and décolletage, catching the light and creating an ethereal, otherworldly glow. She was, by all accounts, breathtaking. She was also, by any medical standard, a walking vessel of poison. The lead from the cerussa was steadily leaching through her pores, beginning its insidious journey into her bloodstream, targeting her nervous system and her bones. The mercury in the cinnabar was a volatile neurotoxin, and with every nervous lick of her lips, she was ingesting a tiny, incremental dose. The antimony in her kohl was a lesser evil, but still a heavy metal with its own cumulative price. On her wedding night, As Gellius fumbled with the intricate fastenings of her stola, his breath heavy with sour wine, Livia felt a profound and chilling detachment. The constant, low-grade headache had sharpened into a piercing spike behind her right eye. A wave of nausea, which she had attributed to nerves, washed over her, and she had to grip the bedpost to steady herself. The man grunting above her was not making love to her, but to the artifice she presented. He was possessing the statue, the symbol, the pale-faced ideal of Roman femininity. The real Livia, the girl with the throbbing head and the metallic taste in her mouth, was a prisoner within it. In the months that followed, her health began a more noticeable decline. She suffered from bouts of debilitating colic, sharp, twisting pains in her abdomen that would leave her breathless and pale a pallor that, ironically, was much admired by the other senators' wives, who saw it as a sign of delicate breeding rather than systemic poisoning. She was perpetually fatigued, a bone-deep weariness that the physicians, old men who subscribed to the humoral theories of Hippocrates, diagnosed as an excess of black bile, a melancholic disposition common in young wives. Their prescription was not to question the cosmetics that were the obvious culprit, but to recommend bloodletting and bland diets, treatments that only served to weaken her further. The complicity of the medical establishment was absolute. These men, the supposed guardians of health, were themselves products of the same patriarchal system. To suggest that the very tools of aristocratic female beauty were the cause of illness would be to challenge the bedrock of their social order. It was unthinkable. And so, the physicians became enforcers of the system, their ignorance and their deference to tradition making them agents of Livia's slow destruction. They would nod sagely, prescribe their useless remedies, and leave Livia to the care of Lyra, who would dutifully reapply the very poisons that were killing her. The tragic loop was complete. The sickness was diagnosed as a feminine weakness, and the prescribed cure was to double down on the performance of that femininity. The pressure to produce an heir began almost immediately. In the world of Roman aristocracy, a wife's primary function was to secure the family lineage. Livia's beauty had sealed the alliance. Her womb was meant to cement it. But month after month, her body refused to cooperate. Her menstrual cycles, once regular, became erratic and painful, a chaotic rebellion against the toxins coursing through her. Gellius, a man for whom failure was an alien concept, grew impatient. His initial pride in his beautiful young wife curdled into a simmering resentment. The whispers started in the shaded porticos of the forum and among the women weaving in the courtyards. Was the new bride barren? Was there some hidden flaw, some divine displeasure? The shame was a physical weight on Livia, heavier than the lead on her face. Her mother, Vipsania, began to visit more frequently, her face a mask of concern that did little to hide her own anxiety. The family's honor was at stake. During these visits, the beauty rituals intensified, becoming desperate, frantic acts of supplication. They were no longer just about maintaining status, but about magically invoking fertility. New, more dangerous concoctions were introduced. Livia was made to drink tonics laced with henbane and mandrake, powerful hallucinogens believed to stimulate the womb, which only left her disoriented and racked with terrifying visions. She was subjected to fumigations, where she was forced to sit over smoldering herbs and minerals, a practice that filled her lungs with acrid smoke and further damaged her already compromised health. The connection between the lead she slathered on her face and her inability to conceive was a truth that remained just beyond the reach of their understanding. Modern science understands that lead is a potent reproductive toxin. It mimics calcium, embedding itself in the bones and disrupting the endocrine system. It can prevent ovulation, damage the development of a fertilized egg, and cause miscarriages and stillbirths. Livia was, in essence, systematically sterilizing herself every single morning. The irony was grotesque. In her relentless pursuit of the ideal of Roman womanhood, an ideal inextricably linked to motherhood, she was destroying the very biological capacity that defined that role. Her body had become a battlefield. The desire for a child, a primal, human urge, was at war with the culturally imposed imperative of artificial beauty. The constant pain and fatigue worsened. She suffered from tremors in her hands, making it difficult to hold a stylus or a piece of fruit. Her memory began to fail her in small, frightening ways. She would forget the name of a household slave she had known for years, or lose her train of thought mid-sentence. These were the classic signs of chronic lead poisoning, the creeping paralysis of the nervous system known as Saturnism. To her husband and her family, these symptoms were not evidence of poisoning, but of a weak and hysterical female mind. Gellius began to openly mock her spells and vapors. He took a succession of healthy, rosy-cheeked slave girls to his bed, flaunting their fecundity as a constant, brutal reproach to Livia's perceived failure. Livia, trapped in her gilded cage, could only watch. She would catch her reflection in a polished bronze mirror and see the perfect white face of a stranger, a beautiful, serene mask hiding a universe of pain, confusion, and decay. The mask was all that mattered. It was her armor and her prison, and she could no more remove it than she could stop breathing. To appear without her face on would be to admit defeat, to declare herself unwell, imperfect, and unworthy. And so, every morning, with Lyra's trembling assistance, she would reapply the lead, adding another layer to her own tomb. The first pregnancy ended in the 3rd month. It was a brief flicker of hope, extinguished in a wave of blood and agonizing cramps. Livia was confined to her bed for a week, her body weak, her spirit shattered. Gellius did not visit her once. His displeasure was a cold, heavy silence that filled the villa. The physicians who were summoned clucked their tongues and spoke of an unreceptive womb and poor humors. They bled her again, leaving her even more drained and anemic. No one, not even Livia herself, made the connection between the lead that whitened her face and the darkness that had claimed the life in her womb. The cultural blind spot was absolute. The pursuit of beauty was a sacred duty, and the tools of that pursuit were beyond reproach. To question the cerussa would be as heretical as questioning the gods. After she recovered, the pressure redoubled. Vipsania brought in a new physician, a stern man from Alexandria famed for his fertility treatments. His methods were even more invasive and bizarre. He prescribed a diet that consisted almost entirely of pungent herbs and strange seafood, and forced Livia to wear amulets filled with foul-smelling substances. The daily cosmetic ritual continued unabated, a non-negotiable foundation of her existence. Lyra, the Greek slave, was now visibly ill. A persistent, hacking cough racked her thin frame. Her hands shook so much that she could barely hold the coal stick steady. A permanent blue-black line had appeared along her gums, a telltale sign of severe, chronic lead poisoning. Livia saw Lyra's decay as a terrifying premonition, a glimpse into her own future. She was looking at a ghost. Yet, the system they were trapped in offered no escape. Lyra's duty was to apply the poison, and Livia's was to wear it. They were bound together in a slow, shared suicide, a silent pact of suffering mandated by the world outside their chamber. The second pregnancy made it to the 5th month. This time, a fragile optimism had taken root. Livia had felt the first faint flutters of movement, a tiny, secret conversation that filled her with a fierce, protective love. She began to dream of a life beyond her reflection in the mirror, a life defined by something other than her appearance, but the dream dissolved into a nightmare. The colic returned with a vengeance, her limbs swelled, and the headaches became blinding. One feverish night, she went into a premature, violent labor. The child, a boy, was born still and silent, his tiny body terrifyingly perfect and unnervingly blue. The midwife, a pragmatic, hardened woman, wrapped the body and took it away before Livia could even hold him. The grief was a physical thing, a hollow dread that settled in her stomach like a stone. Gellius's reaction was not sorrow, but cold fury. He saw the stillbirth not as a tragedy, but as a personal insult, a failure of the property he had acquired. He accused Livia of being cursed, of bringing ill fortune to his house. His cruelty, once veiled in passive aggression, now became overt. He took to dining alone, leaving Livia to eat in her chambers, attended only by the spectral, coughing figure of Lyra. The isolation was absolute. Livia was a prisoner in her own home, her only companion, the slave who was both the agent and a fellow victim of her slow demise. The lead was now firmly entrenched in her system. It had crossed the placental barrier, poisoning her children in the womb. The very substance she used to project an image of aristocratic perfection and vitality was the agent of death for her offspring. The tragic paradox was complete. She was a beautiful vessel, meticulously maintained on the outside, But inside, she was a repository of toxins, incapable of nurturing life. Her body, which should have been a source of power and continuity, had become a tomb. The descent into madness was not a sudden fall, but a slow, grinding erosion of the self. The physical symptoms of lead poisoning were now inextricably linked with a profound psychological decay. Livia began to experience fits of uncontrollable weeping, followed by periods of vacant, unnerving calm. Hallucinations flickered at the edges of her vision's shadowy figures, skittering along the corridors, whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Her memory, once merely faulty, was now a tattered ruin. She would wander through the rooms of the villa with no recollection of how she got there, her own home as alien to her as a foreign land. Gellius, interpreting her condition through the lens of Roman superstition and his own callous ego, declared her possessed by malevolent spirits, or larvae. He saw her illness as a supernatural affliction, a punishment for some unknown transgression, rather than the direct, physiological consequence of the cosmetics he so admired. This diagnosis served his purposes perfectly. It absolved him of any responsibility and further isolated Livia, marking her as a source of spiritual contagion. He forbade her from attending banquets or receiving visitors, effectively erasing her from the social world. Her existence shrank to the confines of her lavishly appointed chambers, a gilded cage where the bars were forged from fear and ignorance. The physicians, when they were still summoned, would now stand at a safe distance, muttering incantations and prescribing purifying rituals instead of medicines. They had become exorcists, their medical authority dissolving into priestly theater. They were no longer even pretending to treat her body. They were attempting to cast out the demons they believed inhabited her mind. The tragic irony was that the demons were, in fact, heavy metals. The lead was attacking her brain, causing encephalopathy swelling and damage that leads to cognitive impairment, personality changes, and psychosis. The mercury from the cinnabar on her lips was compounding the damage, contributing to the tremors, the emotional volatility, and the terrifying slide into insanity. Her suffering was not supernatural, it was chemical. But in a world without germ theory, without toxicology, her very real physical agony was dismissed as female hysteria, a spiritual failing. Lyra, her health completely broken, was finally replaced. The Greek slave, who had been a constant, silent witness to Livia's entire adult life, was sent away likely to the slave infirmary to die, her body a testament to the occupational hazards of aristocratic beauty. Her replacement was a young, frightened girl from Gaul who did not understand the silent language of suffering that had existed between Livia and her predecessor. The new girl applied the cerussa with a clumsy, fearful hand, her eyes wide with apprehension as she painted the face of the madwoman of the house. For Livia, the ritual was now the only anchor in a sea of confusion. The feel of the cool, heavy lead on her skin was one of the few remaining sensations that felt familiar. The mask was no longer just a tool for social survival. It was the only identity she had left. When she caught a glimpse of her reflection, the blank, white, inhuman face was a comfort. That serene, unchanging visage was a liar, but it was a consistent liar. It did not weep or tremble or scream. It was perfect. In her lucid moments, rare and fleeting as sunlight in a storm, Livia would sometimes touch the smooth, painted surface of her own cheek and feel a pang of a loss so profound she could not name it. It was the loss of herself. The girl who had once hidden behind a curtain, watching her mother with a child's awe, was gone, buried alive under a mountain of beautiful, toxic dust. The end came not with a dramatic confrontation or a moment of tragic realization, but with a quiet, pathetic fizzle. Livia's body, ravaged by years of systemic poisoning, simply began to shut down. She became bedridden, her limbs too weak and racked with pain to support her. The saturnine gout, a common affliction of the lead-poisoned Roman elite, had set in, her joints swelling into agonizing, immobile knots. She lost the ability to feed herself, her hands shaking too violently to hold a spoon. The colic had become a constant, grinding fire in her gut, and she could keep down little more than sips of watered wine. Her world had shrunk to the confines of a single bed, the opulent frescoes on the ceiling of her chamber, the last landscape she would ever see. Even in this state of near-total collapse, the tyranny of appearance held its grip. Gellius, concerned only with the shame of having a visibly decaying wife, ordered that she be kept presentable. The young Gallic slave, her fear now replaced with a desensitized resignation, would come each morning to perform a macabre parody of the beauty ritual. She would prop Livia's emaciated form up against the pillows and apply the cerussa to her waxy, sunken face. She would paint the lips, now thin and bloodless, with the vibrant, mocking red of the cinnabar. It was a grotesque pantomime, the painting of a corpse. Livia was often not even conscious for the procedure, her mind lost in the fog of encephalopathy. But the mask had to be maintained. Her identity as a beautiful, aristocratic woman had to be preserved, even as the woman herself was ceasing to exist. The physicians had long since abandoned her, their useless remedies exhausted. Gellius now spent most of his time at his country estate, distancing himself from the miasma of sickness and failure that clung to his city villa. Livia was left to the care of slaves, a forgotten object in a quiet room. Her death, when it came, was a mercy. Her breathing grew shallow, her body, having fought for so long, finally surrendered. She died alone, in the dim light of an oil lamp, her face a perfect white mask. The official cause of death, as recorded by a physician who hadn't examined her in months, was a wasting sickness of the womb, a suitably vague and feminine diagnosis that placed the blame squarely on the perceived failings of her own body. It mentioned nothing of the lead, the mercury, the arsenic, the slow, methodical poisoning that had been the true cause. Her funeral was a grand affair. Gellius, ever the politician, understood the importance of public grief. He spared no expense. Livia's body was laid out on a ceremonial bier, dressed in the finest silk, her face, of course, perfectly painted. The mourners who filed past spoke in hushed tones of her delicate beauty, her tragic, childless life, and the terrible fragility of the female constitution. They looked upon the serene white mask and saw the ideal of Roman womanhood. They did not see the victim of a brutal and relentless system. They did not see a woman whose body had been a chemical wasteland, whose mind had been shattered, and whose children had been poisoned before they could draw breath. They saw only the artifice, because the artifice was all that was ever meant to be seen. The truth of Livia's life, the agonizing story of her slow poisoning, was buried with her, hidden forever behind a beautiful, deadly mask of white lead. Livia's story is not an anomaly, it is a brutal archetype. For every empress like Poppaea, famed for her masks of ass's milk, there were thousands of anonymous Livias, patrician women trapped in the same gilded, toxic cage. Their suffering was the quiet, unrecorded cost of the Roman patriarchy's obsession with a manufactured ideal. This was a society that could engineer aqueducts that stretched for miles, a legal system that would influence the world for millennia, and a military that could conquer continents. Yet it remained willfully blind to the poisons being slathered on the faces of its own daughters and wives. The complicity was systemic, a conspiracy of silence that stretched from the slave mines, where the lead was harvested, to the physicians who misdiagnosed the inevitable symptoms. The men who wrote the histories, poets like Ovid who penned guides to cosmetics, saw the artifice as a charming, if sometimes deceptive, aspect of the feminine mystique. They wrote of the cultivated woman, the woman who improves upon nature. They failed to see, or refused to acknowledge, that this improvement was a form of self-mutilation, a slow, creeping suicide sanctioned and encouraged by the very culture that claimed to adore its women. The physicians, bound by the flawed humoral theories of their time, interpreted the signs of heavy metal poisoning, the colic, the paralysis, the madness, as uniquely female failings. Saturnism in men, often contracted through lead-lined wine amphorae or water pipes, was sometimes correctly identified. But in women, the same symptoms were invariably diagnosed as hysteria, a wandering womb, or a melancholic disposition. The female body was seen as inherently unstable, a leaky, mysterious vessel, and its illnesses were interpreted as moral or emotional failings rather than physiological responses to environmental toxins. This medical misogyny provided the perfect cover for the beauty industry's deadly secrets. It created a feedback loop of suffering. The sicker a woman became from the cosmetics, the more her condition was seen as proof of her inherent female weakness, a weakness that could only be masked by more cosmetics. we are left with a haunting historical echo. We excavate the villas of Pompeii and Herculaneum and find the small glass pots of cerussa, the contents still intact, a silent testament to this deadly vanity. We analyze the bones from Roman cemeteries and find grotesquely high concentrations of lead, particularly in the skeletons of wealthy women. The evidence is there, written in the very remains of the dead. It tells a story of a society that valued the appearance of female purity and health over the reality of it. It speaks of a world where a woman's face was not her own, but a public canvas upon which her family's status was painted. The price for a flawed stroke, a cracked surface, or an unmasked reality was social oblivion. The ultimate cost, for so many, was life itself. Livia's tragedy is the tragedy of a system that demanded women be both ornaments and vessels for procreation, while promoting a standard of beauty that made both roles a slow path to destruction. It is a somber reflection on the human cost of artifice, and a chilling reminder that the most dangerous prisons are often the ones we are taught to see as beautiful. The insidious legacy of these toxic habits did not die with the fall of Rome. It slithered through the centuries, changing its form but not its fundamental nature. The Elizabethan era saw European courts embrace a ghostly pallor, with Queen Elizabeth I herself famously using a cosmetic called Venetian cerussa, a direct descendant of the Roman formula, a corrosive mixture of white lead and vinegar. She, too, suffered from the telltale signs of lead poisoning, hair loss, skin deterioration, and bouts of severe illness, all while presenting a public image of ageless, almost supernatural perfection. The desire for a pure, white complexion, a symbol of leisure and racial purity, continued to drive women to whiten their skin with lead, arsenic, and mercury-based compounds well into the 19th century. The consumption chic of the Victorian era, where a pale, fragile look was seen as the height of feminine beauty, was often achieved through the subtle, domestic poisoning of arsenic-laced wafers, sold under the guise of being complexion enhancers. These products promise to give the eyes a brilliant sparkle and the skin a translucent pallor, mimicking the symptoms of tuberculosis, a disease that was morbidly romanticized at the time. The parallels to Rome are chilling. In both eras, a standard of beauty was promoted that was, in essence, a performance of sickness, a slow self-destruction in the name of fashion. The system of complicity also endured. For centuries, physicians, chemists, and merchants continued to profit from the sale of these known poisons, often marketing them with pseudo-scientific claims while ignoring the mounting evidence of their devastating effects. Just as in Rome, the victims were often blamed for their own suffering, their illnesses dismissed as vanity or female weakness. The voices of those who warned against these practices were frequently drowned out by the powerful economic and cultural forces that upheld the status quo. It was not until the rise of modern chemistry and a more robust regulatory environment in the 20th century that the most overtly toxic ingredients began to be systematically removed from mainstream cosmetics. Yet, the ghost of the Roman beauty ideal lingers. The core concept that a woman's natural face is a flaw to be corrected, a canvas to be painted over, remains a powerful undercurrent in the modern beauty industry. The language has changed from whitening to brightening, from cerussa to foundation, but the fundamental goal of creating a uniform, flawless, and often unattainable surface remains. We may have traded lead and mercury for less acutely toxic chemicals, but the psychological pressure to conform to an artificial standard is arguably more pervasive than ever, amplified by the digitally altered images of social media. The story of Livia is therefore not just a dark chapter from a distant past, it is a cautionary tale. It reveals how deeply intertwined the aesthetics of a culture can be, with its blind spots and its cruelties. It demonstrates how beauty can be weaponized, transformed into a tool of social control that encourages women to participate in their own subjugation, to literally poison themselves in the pursuit of an ideal that was designed by a system that did not value their health or their lives. It is a stark reminder that when a society prizes the mask over the person, the cost is always paid by the one forced to wear it, a debt settled in silence, suffering, and all too often, in premature death. The psychological toll of this daily ritual is perhaps the most horrifying, yet least documented, aspect of the entire phenomenon. Imagine the cognitive dissonance required to live Livia's life. To know, on some level, that the substance you are applying is a poisona fact understood by the slaves who processed it and hinted at in the writings of natural philosophers like Pliny the Elder, and yet to apply it every single day. To feel the headaches, the nausea, the creeping paralysis in your own body, and to be told by everyone around you, from your mother to your physician, that this is normal, that this is the price of womanhood. This is not merely a beauty regimen, it is a form of systematic gaslighting, a cultural brainwashing so complete that it forces the victim to become a willing accomplice in her own destruction. The ritual itself becomes a form of addiction. The cerussa mask hides the very damage it creates. As the lead causes skin ulcers, discoloration, and decay, the only solution is to apply a thicker layer of lead to hide the blemishes. The victim becomes trapped in a cycle of dependency, reliant on the poison to conceal the evidence of its own work. The face in the mirror, the perfect white mask, becomes a source of both comfort and terror. It is the face of her social identity, the face that earns her husband's approval and the admiration of her peers, but it is also the face of her killer. This daily act of self-erasure would inevitably lead to a profound loss of self. Who is Livia? Is she the thinking, feeling, suffering human being beneath the paint? Or is she the serene, flawless statue that the world sees? Over time, these two identities would become impossible to reconcile. The mask would begin to feel more real than the face it covered. The personality changes induced by lead poisoning, the irritability, the depression, the paranoia would further blur the lines. As her mind began to decay, her sense of self would fragment. She would look at her own trembling hands and not recognize them as her own. She would hear her own slurred speech and feel as if a stranger were speaking. This is the ultimate horror of her condition. It was not just a poisoning of the body, but a dismantling of the soul. The system provided no language for her suffering. When she felt the abdominal colic, it was a wandering womb. When her mind faltered, it was hysteria. Her legitimate, physiological pain was consistently reinterpreted as a psychological or moral failing inherent to her gender. She was trapped in a prison of semantics, unable to even articulate her own reality in a way that would be believed. Her pain was real, but her culture rendered it illegitimate. This constant invalidation is a form of psychological torture. To be in agony and to be told your agony is not real, or that it is your own fault, is enough to drive anyone to madness, even without the added burden of neurotoxins. In her final years, Livia, wandering her villa in a confused daze, was the living embodiment of this torture. The beautiful blank mask of her face was a perfect metaphor for her inner state, a hollowed-out shell, the person within erased, silenced, and forgotten long before her body finally gave out. The true tragedy is that she died without ever understanding what had been done to her. She died believing she was flawed, cursed, or mad. She never knew that she was, in fact, a victim of a deliberate and systematic poisoning, a casualty of a war fought on the surfaces of women's bodies, a war in which beauty was the weapon and silence was the deadliest wound.